So why should you read the Discworld series by Terry Pratchett? Sir Terry Pratchett, indeed. One of my favourite series. It's one of the series that if I were told or asked what are the 3 or 5 most important fantasy series you could read, I don't even mean best, I just mean I only have time to read 5 series and I want to read all the books in the series. What would I recommend? And I would recommend, I think, Discworld. It's a big series, that's one thing, albeit they tend to be short books and very easily read. Comparatively short books, that's 400 pages still. Some are a lot shorter than that. But they tend to be shortish and easy to read. But there are over, I think, 41 by the time that Sir Terry died. So book 41 is The Shepherd's Crown, I think. Corrections accepted in the comments. So it's a big series, but and there's lots of corners, and I will talk about that. But it's nonetheless very digestible, easy to read, and does some things that are really interesting. One thing is, okay, so it's comic fantasy. So first, yes, you might think, well, I don't really want to read any comic fantasy. I want to read serious fantasy. I like epic fantasy or something like that. And fair enough. One thing to say is that these are funny books. I laugh at them. One thing I realised when I reread Guards last year was that I do laugh at these books. But one reason I don't laugh is how much they've invaded my sense of humour and how much they are integral, I guess, to the way I think about things. And so I was sometimes making the jokes with him because I was so set up for his sense of humour. But they are genuinely funny. I do laugh out loud at them. Lots of people, I think, will as well. So yeah, that might be a strike against it for you. You might not want anything funny. But they are a lot more than funny books. To call them comic fantasy is potentially a disservice because, in the same, I suppose, as an inverse of Sir Terry mocking the term magical realism as basically just upmarket fantasy, comic fantasy might sound like they're just funny books. But there are 2 other things, apart from decent, very good writing style, very clean and easy and enjoyable and witty writing style, and very solid structural work, good plots on the whole. Not always amazing, but good. But the 2 big advantages that these books have beyond being humorous, because structure and obviously writing style are very important to humour. One thing you can tell in the last couple of books where he is dictating, because he had early onset dementia, dictating to a voice recognition software, is there is different punctuation because the way it's gone through the editorial process is different and the punctuation makes a difference. The last books are fun, but they're not as funny. But the point is that that's the funny side, but what's more than funny is, I think, this is really too posh a term, but philosophy, and the other one is characters. By philosophy, I mean that he talks about things. He wants to talk about human existence, human concerns. He wants to talk about growing up and coming to grips with responsibility. He wants to talk about the nature of religious belief. He wants to talk about human psychology and, I guess, the nature of leadership, justice in Guards. Lots of things. He wants to talk about things, and he wants to do it in a light and easy, frothy way. You think it's frothy, but you get to grips with these quite interesting discussions in a way that he is open about his views often, though his views are often nuanced as well. But they're open-handed as well. What I mean is that there is an invitation into a discussion down the pub rather than simply being didactic. There are didactic moments, but it's not simply didactic. And I think there's a difference there between the way he, say, compared to Philip Pullman, who is actually less open and much more didactic. Pratchett is more open, less didactic, but nonetheless very convinced of his own views. And I think I read these. Some of his views have definitely been ones I've adopted that have stuck with me. Some are ones I disagree with. But I find the way he sets up characters and plot and humour to discuss these issues really clever. And so if you're interested in books that talk about things intelligently rather than just doing the other good stuff well, but the books that really want to move on to discussing issues without it becoming an invasive and destructive feature of the book, then the Discworld series is a good series. And the final kind of big point I would say in favour is characters. There are plenty of other things I suddenly realised I could be like, oh, but just there's such amazing moments and such incredible lines. Dialogue is such a strength. But the thing that sticks with me that I think I want to leave as the other big thing in the favour of these books is the characters. That the characters are so often richer and more subtle, whilst starting as archetypes, but even within a book, let alone over multiple books within a sub-series, developing and being like people you know. They are some of the best observed characters you can imagine. And say compared to really good character worker Joe Abercrombie, one thing with Abercrombie is that though his characters, the way in which they understand their own frailty is incredibly powerful and incredibly real. The characters themselves aren't necessarily incredibly resonant of people you know. You know what I mean? I'm not saying they don't have any similarities with real people. I just mean that they are drawn. They are as it were perverted, or not perverted. That's the wrong way. Inverted versions of heroic fantasy characters, because it is heroic fantasy, the first law, but just dark heroic fantasy. Whereas in Discworld, these are people you know. They're people you like or dislike, and they're all drawn with sympathy. They're all drawn by someone who, even when they are wicked and frustrating and evil, there is just nearly always, or virtually always, I think perhaps always, just this hint of sympathy, of care for human weakness. And the way they are presented in the world, the way they interact with things, the things they want, the character arcs they go on are good. And some of those are better achieved than others. You know, Tiffany Aching, Granny Weatherwax, and Sam Vimes, all very well completed arcs, whereas others like Captain Carrot, or maybe to a lesser degree Moist Von Lipwig, you know, less complete, less satisfying. But yeah, those are the things I'd say about, if that appeals to you, you should give at least one book in this series a try. A very good starting place, or is, I'll talk about the sub-series in a moment, but just if you want a starting place, Guards, the first in the Guards, in the Guards series, about a washed up city policeman who ends up regaining his love for justice by investigating what seems to be a mythical dragon attack, or a series of dragon attacks. And another that is often recommended, I haven't reread for a while, but I'll mention it as one that is really often recommended, Small Gods, about a god who only has one believer and so has grown very weak and can barely do anything, but this one believer has such a pure faith, because gods are invented by humans in game, or at least become gods by being believed in by humans. And so this god ends up going around with this one believer and trying to sort things out and rebuild a religion. And those are two really, and that's a standalone as well, which means that it is a one and done thing. You don't, if you liked it but not enough to keep reading, you won't feel any FOMO for not going into the rest of the series. Now, I think, and again, offer corrections in the comments, I think there are, generally agreed to be, 6 proper sub-series and one either a catch-all for everything else, or many micro sub-series bagged into one. Now, the first of these, chronologically, because it starts with the first 2 books, Color of Magic and Light Fantastic, is the Rincewind series. This is Sorcery, the 3rd book in that series, I think. Rincewind is a wizard. He's a very cowardly wizard. He's an awful person, very bad at magic. Wizards are very powerful, Rincewind is not. He ends up, and this is really to the blessing of his survival, with a very violent piece of animated luggage. And this is how Discworld debuted, and it was very successful. Now, Discworld fans tend to look back on the Rincewind series as a weaker section of the series. Because I think, not just some inartful things in those first couple of books, but because it is the place where Pratchett's enjoyment of satirising fantasy tropes is strongest. Because that's what the first 2 books are. They are much more satire of fantasy than they are a new form of comic fantasy. And so, and I think the point is, throughout the Rincewind sub-series, that's really a major emphasis, is this kind of like, what fantasy trope is not just going to be used today, but sort of like pratfalled and raspberried today. And I think that has landed less well over time. Actually, do you know what, as much because our view of tropes has changed? I don't mean because there aren't still funny tropes, but because of what we think tropes are now. What are common tropes, what is resonant to us compared to what was resonant in the mid-80s. It's a classic topical comedy issue. Maybe also connected to that is that because that's such an emphasis, character work suffers comparatively. The characters and the discussions, the philosophy, are not as interesting. The second sub-series is The Witches. This is Weird Sisters, the second of the Witches series, the 6th Discworld book in itself, but the third Discworld book, Equal Rights, which I reviewed last year, is the first Witches series, and that it's basically about Granny Weatherwax and then increasingly other witches, Margaret Garlock, Nanny Ogg most famously, Agnes Nitt, who mostly, theoretically, live and work up in the mountains in a rural area, and they have magic, but it's much more subtle magic than the wizards, and they're massively into psychology, or headology as they call it, what you can get done via convincing people to do something through fear and incentives. Just courses about incentives would be a wonderful thing if you had, if you're going to come up with ridiculous things to teach at school. Frankly, teaching how you incentivize things would be better than most things people come up with for that. And the Witches books are all about that. Psychology and reputation and soft power. They go elsewhere, they travel around the world and they do different things. And in many ways, it's fair to say that though, one of the two big series and thematic series was The Witches, and due to what I'll mention in a bit, the Witches themselves become the largest part, numerically, statistically, of the Discworld oeuvre. Next, book 4 is Mort, and Mort is the first in the Death sub-series. There are, four or five Death books if you count Thief of Time, and the Death books are ones about the anthropomorphized conception of Death, who collects people's souls upon their death. And basically, Death, who speaks like this, is a nice guy. He's he has a family. He wants to discover things about the world. He also is very serious about his job. Nonetheless, many of these books are basically about what happens when he can't do his job or when his job becomes more complicated. They're really about his employment prospects. And what is great about the Death books, I think, is that Death himself is a really wonderfully realised character, much like Granny Weatherwax, to be fair as well. And I think, and justly famous. There's a degree of repetition amongst some of those books. Then again, Hogfather was my first Discworld book, and I laughed a great deal. They're clever, they're funny, there are some really creative, wonderful, mind-bending things. In fact, some of the most mind-bending Discworld sequences are in Death books. I'm thinking about some weird stuff in Reaper Man, which I think non-British people struggle to get, albeit, and in Hogfather. So, yeah, that is another well-loved sub-series. After that, probably, actually, I'm trying to think, the next set of books that were published is, because I think Pyramids is book 7, is it? Or maybe Moving Pictures, is just the standalones. Small Gods is a good example of that, the one I mentioned as a potential starter. Standalones are sometimes divided into sub-series, particularly Industrial Revolution and Ancient Civilizations. But essentially, they don't share major characters. They hop around the world. They are really about whatever theme he came up with, and then retroactively they've been grouped. But you can see interest he had, which was one, how the world in the Discworld kept changing. Moving Pictures involves the advent of the slightly strange and magical advent of moving pictures, films you could watch. On the other hand, the Truth is a book about the first printing press and what happens in this fantasy world when there's newspapers. And the same with, this happens in a later sub-series or related to that, what happens with semaphore towers. The idea that this is a world that's changing, that's undergoing an industrial revolution. The Ancient Civilizations ones, both the two that we can't really think of as that, Pyramids and Small Gods, are much more standalone in the sense they're not about those big themes, but are about, in each case, just a specific theme that he came up with, and that happened to be set in a in Ankh-Morpork centre of the world, industrial revolution kind of setting. So you could also count The Last Hero into that, one of the two illustration novels technically, but the one that is more commonly seen as a graphic novel with prose as well, confusingly. And one of the YA novels, Amazing Morris and His Educated Rodents, is also technically a standalone with nothing else connected. So where are we now? We are on to the Guards. Guards. This one is the first in that series, and this is probably, many people would say, like along with The Witches, the strongest or most important Discworld sub-series. Guards, very highly recommended starter. I think, what's widely agreed to be the best Discworld novel, Night Watch, is a Guards novel. I think I'd go so far as to say that if you were to just really press a lot of Discworld fans, Sam Vimes of the Guard, of the Ankh-Morpork City Guard, Night Watch, he is, and his stories are the most important. You know, people give different opinions, but that's what I think if you were to force people to pick. And I think it's because here, as well as having some of the clearest character arc work and development and change, you know, what happens to these different characters in this organisation as it finds its way out of decrepitude due to the incident of the dragon. I think, as well as that, it's got great plots. It has some of the coolest moments. There's stuff in, say, Thud and Night Watch, which are, I think, surely, and to be fair, the 1,000,000 to 1 chance in Guards, which must be in the top 10. All of those must be in the top 20 at least, and probably in the top 10 for a couple of them, Discworld moments. So yeah, I think there's a lot of good stuff there. It's an ensemble cast. You see it development in it and shift and change with lots of them. You see his social vision very clearly, probably most clearly through the Guards books. For good or for bad, you disagree or agree. So yeah, that's the Guards. There were then 2 late series he started after having become enormously successful, and I think both started, after he'd written the 30th Discworld book or thereabouts. So I guess I can have a check. Discworld, this is Going Postal. I'm looking at which, must be pushing around the 30th novel out of 41. Going Postal, Moist von Lipwig. There were 3 books in this series, I think. Going Postal, Making Money, and Raising Steam. These were Industrial Revolution books, but about a thief who, rather than being hanged, is pardoned and turned into a problem solver for the famous or infamous patrician of Ankh-Morpork, Lord Vetinari. He believed in one man, one vote. He was the man. He had the vote. And Moist becomes a troubleshooter to fix government departments that don't work. And he's, in that sense, a Suicide Squad, but for bureaucracy. And the Moist novels are a very popular late set of novels. And justly so. I think Raising Steam struggles because of some of the issues that don't ruin but do affect the last couple of novels. But Going Postal and Making Money are very popular. Going Postal on its own, if it were not for the fact that I do think Experience in the World Growing is good, Going Postal is recommended as a first novel. It's funny, it's clever, it has new types of characters, new character dynamics, new problems, the particular emphasis of really spinning out of those other Industrial Revolution novels, rather than just saying, oh, here's a weird discovery, here's some magical nonsense that happens. There's actually the issue of how in a magical world would you run a government? And in that sense, it's very interesting insight. And how do you manage? How do you lead? Very interesting and insightful arc. And you wonder whether really the arc is not there eventually to Lord Vetinari making Moist his successor. Finally, and I though this came before, I think We Free Men came before Going Postal. This is a YA novel, but it's also the last Discworld novel, Shepherd's Crown, which was the 5th in this sub-series, possibly. Again, someone can correct me. But the Tiffany Aching books, which are more witches books. But she is not up in the mountains. She's down on kind of, pasture land a bit further down. The Chalk is what it's called. And she is she starts as a preteen, I think, or something like that, tween possibly, and then she grows into a young woman, and we see her growing over those novels from a girl who basically gets engaged with some weird tiny fairy people, the Nachmachfigel, because her brother has been stolen by the Queen of the Fairies, all the way to being, having to deal with various existential and strange magical threats. Some of his best invention coming in those weird, creepy threats that terrorise her, up to being what was intentionally published posthumously, The Shepherd's Crown, the epilogue to Discworld, which, with a few reservations and critiques, I'd say is still just a wonderful book in lots of ways. And Tiffany, again, like this thing, Tiffany and Moist. Do you notice how I'm saying I'm really often talking about these sub-series by character? Rincewind is perhaps weak because the character work is weak, whereas Death is well-liked if repetitive because people like Death. Granny, Vimes, Tiffany, Moist, all very, very well-loved characters and ones who fully deserved and supported the sub-series they're in. And so, yeah, I think when I say it's YA, when I say Tiffany is YA, that is not a dismissal. They're wonderful books as well, facing growing up and using, in a Buffy-esque way, really, existential threats to represent things about ourselves as we grow up. So that's Discworld. That's why you should read it. That is some of the sub-series and some of my comments on the sub-series and what you might enjoy. Tell me what your favourite Discworld novels are. Tell me why you haven't read Discworld, perhaps, in the comments. Till next time.